And if I can, I am the better twin. So let's go. Twin number one, let's go.
In our parkour lives, a question that we're inevitably going to ask ourselves at some point is, why is he better at me at this thing? And the answer that often comes to mind is genetics. And the reason I picked today's topic is that these brothers are genetically identical. The answer for why one is better at certain things in parkour than the other can't be genetics. There has to be something else explaining this. And it's worth saying before I get into this that when I say better at parkour, that's all I mean. This doesn't say anything about anyone's value as a person. It's just a physical description of someone's ability to jump on or off things. And when I say one is better than the other, what I'm referring to is actually a pretty specific subset of skills within parkour. I mean running, jumping, speed, landing on one foot, this kind of thing. And for the comparison, I'm mostly just going to use this one set of footage from them competing in the same speed competition under the same conditions. The twin on the left I'm going to call shirtless twin, and the twin on the right I'm going to call shirted twin. So shirtless twin is not as good for three clear reasons: because of his head position, his hip angle, and his center of gravity being too far back. In terms of head position, shirtless twin's head ends up too far in front of his body and too low down. It basically starts acting like a weight, pulling him into the ground. So let's look at a few examples of this. So as you can see on this first clip, as the twin is coming through, it's almost like he's being pulled along by his head, and his brother through the same area is much more on top of himself, and I'll cover more why later on. This is really significant. In this clip here, as you can see, he comes down into the landing. The head almost acts like a weight, yanking him down into the ground, and this is going to take away his stability, but also his speed and his control and his ability to balance this movement well. And you can see his brother as he comes into the same movement. Although he still has the same effect going on, it's to a much lesser degree and the movement is less impacted. Here you can see the same thing happening again on an upwards transition. This head kind of acts like a bobble, yanking him down into the ground, and it's taking away his power, but it's also very crucially taking his weight back. On this transition here, you can see his head almost catch him. It's like it blocks him. It's in the way of his own momentum and movement, and he has to slow down to recuperate his head position. His brother, on the other hand, is able to smoothly transition through this without any problems. And you can see on this transition here, his head almost completely pulls him down to the ground. It abruptly stops his momentum, and it makes it very difficult for him to continue this momentum on. His brother, on the other hand, does not have this problem. He's completely upright through his spine, his head is on top of himself, and thus he's able to transition through easily and smoothly. And what's happening here is the muscles on the back of the spine, the thoracic extensor muscles, are not holding up his head well enough, and it's pulling him down. He needs to use these muscles to keep his head on top of himself. And the really unfortunate thing about this head position is that it has to be balanced. And what bodies do to compensate is they take their hips back, and this results in a much steeper, sharper hip angle, and the hips being further back in space. And this is really problematic for parkour for a lot of reasons. So if we look back at that first example, you can see this really clearly. As the shirtless brother's head comes very far forward, his hips come back in space to balance that position. And these hips coming back results in the angle of them being much sharper. And this sharper hip angle is really problematic because it means the leg can never really open up behind itself. It gets stuck in front of him. So you can see here as he's jumping off a block, he's again not getting that full leg extension phase like his brother is here. And it means that as he transitions through, he's not getting as much force through this movement because a leg coming behind you is what generates force. You can see in this transition phase here that looks really awkward for him. Again, the hip angle is much shorter because he's balancing this head that's coming forward, and so this leg doesn't have a chance to come behind him. And you can see his brother has a much wider angle, which allows him to push and come up through the movement a lot better. This example almost goes without saying. You can see that this collapse and this sharp, short angle through his hips completely takes his momentum back down and inside himself, and it's really hard for him to get up out of this and continue moving. His brother, in the same transition, stays very up through this angle and thus isn't caught down back inside himself. And this really is the effect of this head coming forward and hip coming back, is that it results in the center of gravity going back. Because you're stuck back here, the legs can never really open behind you, and the steps really end up being a lot shorter than they should be. And you can really see this in this clip here, where the shirted brother only takes 3 steps, whereas the other takes 4. And they're covering the exact same space, but the quality of the movement feels very different. And you can really see that a lot in the angle of the foot and knee that show up in the shirtless brother. He has this very characteristic outwards foot, inwards knee, and this is really as a result of that hip coming back. As these hips come back into that position, it really gets a lot harder for you to use your glutes. Your glutes are stretching as you go from this open position to closed. And that stretching of the glutes means that if you get really lost in that position like the brother does, with that center of gravity moving back and that head coming forward, you start to lose the functionality on your glutes. They just turn off. And this turning off of the glutes creates a lot of stability problems in the hips. As they turn off, lots of other muscles turn off, and he's losing all of his
external.
Rotators, which is why he's getting this internal rotation through his leg and knee, and his foot is coming out. So how does he fix this, and how do you fix this? Because this is super prolific. I see this all the time. People need to get their heads up on top of themselves, to use their thoracic extensors in the back. And this doesn't mean leaning back. I see a lot of people when they're told to get upright, they just bend through their low back to achieve this position. Your abs have got to stay on. This is coming up through your upper spine. This is a hard movement, and he's got to practice it. In easy context first, just like literally standing around in front of a mirror, and then in harder contexts like medium-sized jumps and so on. 2, he's got to get his hips underneath him, keeping his hip angle more open and keeping that bum functional throughout the whole movement. And as a result of these two things, head more on top and hip angle, the center of gravity has got to end up further forward, so you're able to take those big long steps behind you. When you end up back and trapped down in that position, you can't put your damn leg behind you, and it looks super awkward. Now to finish up, let's just look at a few clips from a few other different contexts because they're really interesting too. So this awkward foot of his shows up even just in something as simple as conging up onto a rail. You can see the difference in the way the two brothers land and the position of their foot and knee relative to each other. It's really pronounced in plyos and movements where they're jumping off both feet, and it very frequently shows up in landings as well. And this is really setting him up for injury problems, which I often say, and you can really see this super clearly when they take height drops. One brother looks like his head is just trying to smash its way through the ground, and the other keeps it relatively upright. The other really sinks back, and you can feel his center of gravity come back into his heels as he gets trapped in that sharper hip angle, and the other brother doesn't do that at all. These differences show up in all contexts, and they matter, and you can fix them. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Peace out.